So we're going to do a couple different things today, right? We're going to talk a little about hypocalcemia, and again, some of the more recent work being done there, some additional work that I think helps us focus our efforts in the industry in terms of how we best prevent hypocalcemia-related things. We'll talk a little about some close-up feeding management considerations, relative to especially controlled energy diets and implementation thereof. We'll spend just a little bit of time on fresh cow feeding strategies. And I'll show you some new data coming out of Sabina Mann's lab, and we've collaborated with it, and Trent Westoff, who's a PhD student here, relative to metabolizable protein or protein feeding with transition cows. And I think we've got some opportunity there, as you'll see. So I'm going to talk about calcium first, and a lot of stuff on this slide. And we certainly have known for a long time that there are relationships between low blood calcium and health and milk production and reproduction and things like that. And if you look at some of the older dates or older studies on this slide, like Curtis in the 80s, they were more focused on clinical milk fever and those relationships with outcomes. The more recent work, really beginning in 2012 and coming on more recently, has really been focused on subclinical hypocalcemia, right? So that would be cows that have low blood calcium, but they're not showing clinical signs associated with a classical milk fever cow. One of the things in the last probably 6 or 7 years we've become more focused on, and it's really Jess McCart's group in the vet school here that's really done a lot of it with her former student Raph Nevis, who's now at Purdue, is that it's the timing matters. Okay, and hypocalcemia manifests itself in different ways. And if you look at the bottom here, we used to focus on the first 24 hours post-calving, and in fact, they discovered that cows with subclinical hypocalcemia within 12 hours post-calving actually were the ones that made more milk. Okay, and it's those cows that really seem to struggle or are delayed in their blood calcium recovery after calving that we really should be probably more concerned about. All right, a lot of stuff on this slide here. Let's see if I can minimize this. Okay, and so what Jess and her group have done has been really to look at the dynamics of subclinical hypocalcemia. And so this is this again is data from a study they did on farms here in New York. And so really what they did is they characterize 4 different forms of calcium dynamics. And one would be what they call normal calcemic, where these cows are basically above the cut point at 1 day in milk, and also above the cut point at 4 days of milk in terms of blood calcium levels. Transient was the second type of disorder or type of calcemia that they characterized, and those cows have low blood calcium at day 1 or within the first day, but then they bounce right back. And by 4 days in milk, they're really have good blood calcium status. Persistent subclinical hypocalcemia, also some people call it chronic, and those are ones that they're low at day 1 and they're still low at day 4. And then finally delayed, where they're low at 1 day in milk, okay, and then I'm sorry, they're above the threshold at 1 day in milk, but by 4 days their blood calcium is kind of below that threshold. Okay, so what does this mean? Okay, well, if you look here at the slide, this is milk production here, and if you just look at the overall, you see the graph here. The cows that were transiently subclinical hypocalcemic, okay, they made the most milk. And if you look here also, they made more milk than so they're at 49 kilos here for the first 10 weeks of calving. Cows where their blood calcium didn't drop at all, they actually were 5 kilos less. Delayed were 8 kilos less. So that's 16, 17 pounds of milk there difference here, right? So again, what we think we want now is cows that they may decrease their blood calcium some at day 1 because they're getting ready to crank out milk, but then their system responds and they recover their blood calcium status fairly quickly. Just looking at some other data, Clara Seeley, who just finished her PhD here with Jess and is now a faculty member at University of New Hampshire, she took our data from studies that we had done relative to calcium status and things like that, and just looked at what are the intakes, what are dry matter intakes in these cows, right? And so if you look here on the left, really there's no difference in dry matter intakes here for these different types of hypocalcemia. But if you look here on the right, Okay, it's really those cows that have either persistent or delayed subclinical hypocalcemia. They've got significantly lower dry matter intakes than cows that were either transiently hypocalcemic or normal calcemic. The other thing they've done is did a bunch of stuff in Repro, and so they assessed cows as either normal calcemic or subclinical at 4 days in milk, and what they found here, there was no difference in these farms relative to time at first AI, but definitely low. The cows are hypocalcemic at 4 days in milk, had lower first service conception rate, tended to be less pregnant or tended to be lower percentage pregnant by 150 days in milk. And if you look at the survival curve on the right, here they had longer median time to pregnancy and they just were slower to get pregnant, right? So again, so a linkage there between this kind of, dyscalcemic there at 4 days in milk and reproductive outcomes. So how do we increase blood or how does blood calcium work, right? Well, this is a cartoon here we put together. So the initial thing that happens is blood calcium drops or decreases in response to colostrum synthesis and milk synthesis, and then the body responds. And so the body responds by the parathyroid gland secreting parathyroid hormone, or PTH. PTH does a couple different things. PTH goes to bone and stimulates calcium release. And that's the mechanism that all of us learned in kind of Dairy 101 and things like that. But PTH also goes to the kidney, activates vitamin D, that drops calcium excretion, and that active vitamin D goes to the intestine and promotes calcium absorption. So the cow kind of has a bimodal or two-way or two different kind of mechanisms by which she can recover her blood calcium. Okay. And so what do we do, right? So, in terms of potential strategies to improve calcium status and hopefully then health performance in repro, we can either consider calcium administration at or after calving as treatment or prophylaxis, okay? Or we can implement, I suppose, we can implement ration formulation strategies for prepartum for close-up diets. And, spoiler alert, it's really this, if we're talking about prevention of hypocalcemia, it really comes back to dietary strategies during that close-up period. I'll give you some illustration for why. So, if you get to supplemental calcium, if we're talking about treatment or prophylaxis, right? We could think about IV calcium. That gives calcium very rapidly available. It is, certainly appropriate. I'm not a veterinarian, but Jess would say definitely appropriate for clinical milk fever, and we would argue unnecessary or even potentially harmful for cows with no clinical signs. Okay. Oral calcium boluses or drenches, right? Those don't provide calcium quickly enough for a cow that's actually got milk fever, who's recumbent, but may be appropriate for suspected subclinical cases or additional supportive therapy. And then sub-Q calcium is kind of intermediate to the other two. This is a slide that I think really illustrates a lot, and this was done in California. And what they did is they had cows that they had characterized as being subclinical hypocalcemic, right? So no clinical signs, okay? And they did one of three things with them, right? The black line with the solid dots is they left them alone, okay? You see time here, and this is the blood calcium levels, okay? They gave him 2 boluses 12 hours apart, right? Calcium boluses, that's the white the white circles here. And you see maybe a little bit of elevation in blood calcium there. Or they gave him an IV. So they gave a bottle of calcium IV, 500 mils of 23% calcium boric gluconate. And what we see here is we get a big spike. Sorry. You get a big spike in blood calcium here, and then these cows actually go hypocalcemic. And I will tell you, we have had a number of herd troubleshooting experiences where herds get too aggressive with IV calcium in cows that probably don't need it, and they actually induce their own milk fevers. Okay, and that is an interesting psychological game to play to get a producer who thinks that this cow needs calcium or is trying to head something off to get them to hold back a bit, because they actually are probably doing more harm than good. Okay, and again, I'd be glad to talk about that more during the Q&A, but it's real. It happens out there. So a lot of boluses out there. If you look at multiple bolus studies that have been done in general, they see no overall response. Okay, so no overall response to the calcium boluses. If you look across the studies, if they start, carving out subcategories of animals, so, old, essentially lame cows, maybe fat cows, keep them away from the heifers. Um, so no overall responses for most of these bolus studies, right? But one thing that's interesting though is Clara and Jess did a study fairly recently, and it's been published now. But they actually worked with 4 farms, about 1,000 cows. And so what they did here is they had 3 treatments. They had a control treatment with no calcium supplementation, iron calving. They had the kind of the conventional bolus approach, which they gave 2 boluses, one at basically calving and one 24 hours later. Okay. And then they had a delayed bolus treatment. And they said, we're going to wait and we're not going to give a bolus at calving or first 24 hours. We're going to give them at 48 and 72 hours. Um, and uh, and so the idea there was, okay, can we maybe help some of these cows with boluses where their blood calcium levels are still low, at 3, 4 days of milk, things like that. Okay. And again, at the herd level, they did not see any overall effect here, right? So control about 49 kilos. So again, these cows are milking well. Again, very you know very similar milk yield here. Did see a treatment by parity interaction though, whereas actually if you look at these parity 3 cows, now again, I'm not sure why parity 3 versus some of the others responded or didn't respond. They actually got a pretty nice milk response to the delayed bolus treatment in these parity 3 cows, right? So, this was not statistically different between the control and the conventional bolus strategy, but there's maybe a little bit less milk there, arguably, in these cows that were given the conventional bolus production, even compared to the controls. Okay, but certainly saw some advantage there. Maybe rescued a few of those cows where with that delayed bolus approach. All right, blood calcium levels really weren't different between the 3 treatments. Again, you see box and whisker plots here at 1 day of milk and 4 days of milk. Okay. All right. So again, if you really talk about prevention, right? We're talking about prepartum dietary management, and really the 2 options that we have in the industry are, to manipulate dietary cation anion difference or DCAD. Okay, and that's been around. We've known about DCAD for prepartum cows since really the early 70s. It first got applied in the 80s in research, kind of applied in the field in the 90s. And we've learned an awful lot about DCAD over time. And so we minimize our high potassium forages. That's why straw and corn silage are both low potassium. They work pretty well in these close-up diets. And then we potentially supplement anions, which would be chloride under sulfur-containing feed supplements. The other approach, and there are different approaches, and we're going to talk about both of them, would be to actualize a low calcium diet through use of a binder. Okay, and binds not only calcium but also phosphorus and potentially magnesium. And so there's a couple different ones on the market now. They're synthetic zeolite A's. Okay, so they're things that certainly can bind some of these cations. Okay. Again, I've said DCAD's been around a long time. This was done on the University of Florida. Jose Santos was the lead on it, had 42 studies. This is a meta-analysis, which is basically a way to statistically summarize research studies. So to get a sense for, okay, what are the general, responses here and things like that to different things. So they had 42 studies, about 1,800 cows. I'll note that very few of these studies had actually first calf heifers in them. Okay, or animals that are going to be first calf heifers. And again, they use that sodium, potassium, chloride, and sulfur equation. And again, the idea with DCAD is to shift that equation to the right, make it more negative. That then, affects the cow's metabolism in a few different ways to help her improve calcium metabolism. So they did their meta-analysis and they did their modeling, right? And they just modeled, cows with a positive DCAD versus a negative, both for first calf heifers, older cows. What we see here is we see a slight decrease in dry matter intake, in pre-calving dry matter intake for cows fed the anions. And now again, Most of these studies were done with all kinds of different sources of anions. The commercial products, which are the ones mainly used these days, they were not the ones used mostly in the 90s. But the ones used these days are definitely more palatable, and we don't tend to see the intake issues with the commercial supplements these days. But they did pick up trends for higher post-calving intake, right? So these cows gained about a kilo of intake, which is about two plus pounds of intake postpartum, and that's a nice intake response there. And then they saw about with DCAD by parity interaction there, not different in the heifers, but in the cows, saw about 3-4 pounds of milk post-calving on average. We've seen as much as 6-7 pounds of milk and things like that in some of the research that we've done. Okay, and that carried through on the fat-corrected milk side. So there's been kind of, at least with DCAD, in the last few years, it's been two what I'll call food fights in the industry relative to DCAD. I think, one of them has been how aggressive should we be? Okay. And so that traditional recommendation, people, again, do DCAD implementation by looking at urine pHs would be targeting 6.2 to 6.8. And the question would be, should we be more aggressive than that and actually be targeting more like 5.5 to 6? Okay. So is there benefit by being a little more aggressive on DCAD? And then what about calcium in the diet, right? There's been the other food fight. There's been one school of thought that we should be down around 0.6 or 0.7, which usually means not a whole lot of supplemental calcium in that diet versus, or you go high, 1.5 or greater percent. So we actually answered that question, or at least we provided some evidence to kind of answer that question here. It's a study that Geneva Graf did in our group, and we're currently working on getting it published in Journal of Dairy Science. She presented it several years ago at ADSA. And essentially what we did here in this study is we targeted either urine pH at 5.7 or about 6.6, and that's actually what the averages were. And then within each of those, we looked at 1.5 calcium or 0.7% calcium. Okay. And basically what Geneva found here was a treatment by DCAD by week interaction or study. And kind of the way this kind of played out was, these cows fed the 1.5 calcium with the more aggressive DCAD, made the most milk at just over, this is 100 pounds of milk right there. Cows, fed the lower calcium and less aggressive DCAD, made the least milk, and the others were kind of in the middle. One other interesting thing that Geneva saw was actually effect on colostrum yield, and this one hasn't necessarily been replicated in the literature per se. But the other thing that she saw was these cows that made the more aggressive DCAD and the higher calcium actually made more colostrum. Okay, and again, I would say that effect is not consistent. Not that many people have looked at that combination before. So just to summarize DCAD, at the farm level, we got to account for mineral changes in forages. Again, wet chemistry techniques are going to be best there, at least for minerals. Consistency is really important, right? And preventing sorting of the diet is really important. We'll talk about that some more. We talk about feeding management. So that comes back to particle size of the TMR, moisture. Commercial products are best, right? So several commercial products out there that do DCAD or are anionic supplements. And we like those the best. Some sources are really poor in palatability. So calcium chloride has been one that's been used over time. I was just in BJ's the other day, and the 25-pound or whatever, or maybe it's more than that, black tub of ice melter, you look at it, it says calcium chloride ice melter, and you can only imagine what the palatability of that stuff is, right? And so another one it's kind of nasty is ammonium chloride. And so again, the commercial products they've done a good job overall of making them much more palatable. Magnesium is important too for calcium metabolism. So mag oxide, we use a lot. Mag sulfate helps us with a little bit of DCAD. There's some commercial magnesium sources as well that you can look at, and again, those I think offer some opportunity as well. And then urine pH monitoring to gauge implementation. So urine pH 6 to 7 has been the general recommendation. I think, again, when we've got good management, we can really be a little more aggressive there. And, we like to do, I get asked a lot about how, variability in urine pHs. And, if you have your variable urine pHs, it says the cows are sorting that diet, okay, because the biology doesn't lie. And so, so what we like to do is collect about 12 to 15 cows, they've been on the diet for at least a week. We like to target about the same time each week. We're going to do it during the day, relative to feeding anyway, and we're shooting for a CV, a coefficient variation of less than 8%, and that's just the standard deviation divided by the mean. So you can calculate that in Excel pretty easily. Okay, hers are really got it nailed with the feeding management of these diets. They're getting that CV down to 4 to 5%. Okay, anything over 10 for sure, 10, 12, 15. You got some real variability going on there in those urines. Okay. All right. So again, the other way we can do it, again, which is just put DCAD off to the side for a minute, because they're two different approaches, is to actualize a low calcium diet by use of a binder. Okay. And so we've known for a long time that if you feed calcium below requirements, you can stimulate the cow's calcium metabolism, but it's got to be really low. And it's really hard to do it based on the feeds and forages that we typically use. So, again, about 25 years ago now, people started looking at these calcium binding compounds that essentially trick the cow into thinking she's deficient in calcium. So this is what it looks like, or one of the products is out there. Again, it can bind to calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. Maybe get more active vitamin D, and things like that. Okay. So we did, at least at the time, Laura Hernandez has now done some additional work with zeolite A, but at the time we did the largest study ever looking at this stuff and published it here a few years ago now, about 5 years ago now. And so what we wanted to do is look at the effect of feeding this binder on mineral status intake and other than performance. And so we had 60 cows in the study, entering second greater lactation. We basically fed them a control energy diet of corn silage, wheat straw, and a grain mix. We had no DCAD supplements in there, no anionic supplements in there. So it was just a low potassium control. And then we used one of the commercially available binders at 500 grams per day as fed. So looking here at some of the results there, we had higher calcium status kind of throughout when cows fed the binder. You see they really didn't decrease their calcium very much after calving. And whereas the controls, again, they definitely experienced a decrease in calcium metabolism. We also saw a decrease in phosphorus levels in the blood, and that started prepartum, and then, kind of recovered after calving. And there's actually some school of thought out there that it may actually be the phosphorus, the low phos triggering the calcium metabolism versus the calcium. But I think that's yet to be fully elucidated. Look at our performance responses here. Essentially, we really had no effect on cow performance. Again, milk yields were, between over 100 pounds for the first 4 weeks. This would be 110 pounds total. So cows milked well, but we had no differences in treatments. Had some minor stuff here with milk fat and MUNs, but not a whole lot. Not really minimal effect on productive performance. All right, gonna switch gears and talk about feeding management. And so, the key things with these dry cow TMR, both far off and close up, is to try to get them to not sort it. And the way we usually do that is we work on the particle size of straw or hay. I'll give you some guidelines here in a minute, but we want the longest particles less than 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters. And then oftentimes we're adding moisture in some way, shape, or form to that TMR and getting it down to probably 44% dry matter plus or minus. Just some guidelines here. Penn State box. Penn State. They've published lactating cow TMR guidelines. These may be a little different. These are also guidelines using the 2 sieve and pan. The older Penn State box setup. Dry cow TMR, we really want, Penn State has not published anything there for recommendations, so we came up with some, and so we tend to target, 10 to 20% on the top and less than 40 in the pan or bottom 2 if you've got the 3 sieve or the fourth or the third sieve anyway for that Penn State box. Straw or hay for the TMR, we go with, kind of this consensus guidelines from Heather Dan and us. So Heather at minor and, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. On the top, middle, and bottom. If you're going to err on one way or the other, you're going to err on the finer side. Okay, so that's probably at most 33% on the top. So Casey Havicus, who used to work with us in extension here at Cornell. Now she's in working with one of the consulting groups. She did her master's with Trevor DeVries at University of Guelph and did a couple neat studies here, kind of illustrating for us what we, kind of what we think we know from the field and what we've experienced in the field anyway, relative to managing these diets. And so this first study she did here, she was looking at long versus short straw chop length in these controlled energy diets. They put either a 1-inch screen or a 4-inch screen in the hay buster. So, and one note here is both diets are about 59% dry matter, so they're pretty dry. Okay, so that's one thing, moisture is important too in helping these diets kind of stick together. If you look at her data, his data is relative to calving. So it's basically the last week before calving in these cows. These cows fed the shorter straw. They had higher dry matter intakes as they approach calving. So that's, that's 2 to 3 pounds difference in intake between those two treatments. And, that's meaningful. Okay. They also looked at rumen pH in these cows and did some modeling here, and they kind of came to the conclusion that maybe these cows fed these shorter straw actually maintained a little higher rumen pH after calving. And you do see that drop in rumen pH as they transition on to that lactating diet. And then the follow-up study, what they did here is they wanted to look at moisture. And so they looked at water addition to control energy dry cow diets. They had no water addition at 53% dry matter. And then water, they brought it down to about 45. And one note here is all their straw in this case was chopped using that 1-inch screen. So again, intake here, cows fed diets with the water added, intake stayed higher. Okay, so that's again about 1 kilo, so 2 to 3 pounds difference here in dry matter intake. So that's meaningful. Okay. And then I thought the really interesting thing in this study is these cows fed the water or fed the diet with the water added, maintained significantly higher rumen pHs after calving. Okay. And look at these cows with no water add. These pHs got pretty low. These cows are acidotic. And so, I don't know fully the mechanism there, whether it just relates to how well they come on to feed or, I don't, or consistency. I don't really know, but I found this to be kind of a really interesting difference here. So we've been doing a field study looking at, trying to look at particle size and different feeding management factors here. So this is actually the first 32 farms enrolled in the study. So these are box and whisker plots. So again, you've got, essentially the mean or median here in the middle of the box. You've got the 50% of the herds are in the box, and then 25% of the herds are in each whisker. Okay. And so this would be the top screen. And so how are herds doing? I'm actually really pleased to see that this is herds from the standpoint of managing the top screen and the bottom are actually doing pretty well. And I say that they're this has improved significantly. So these herds have been collected really in the last year or so, year and a half, compared to a study that we did. We were collecting data 2013, 2014 mostly. They looked a lot worse then. So herds in general that we're working or we're sampling and things like that, they're doing definitely better in terms of managing this particle size out there. So I was really happy to see this. Looking at Penn, so one area of opportunity I do think we have though is actually somewhat on variability across the feed bunk. And so the other thing we're doing in the study is we're sampling 5 different places along the feed bunk in these close-up diets, and then calculating out CVs. And we are seeing some variation here in terms of this CV percent on the top screen here. So we'll we're interested in this, interested in seeing do herds with a lot more variability, are they significantly worse in terms of postpartum outcomes and things like that. They're also doing decently in dry matter management, dry matter percent too. And again, this is not stuff we haven't published. We haven't shown it a whole lot. And again, so our kind of mean and median are right around that 45% range. But we have some herds that are wet, with that TMR, and we have some herds that are dry. And so we're going to be interested to try to sort this out as well. And we also have, we're actually having the same study. I don't have the data here, but we have urine pHs, that we're measuring, and these herds are all being fed DCAD. And so, we're seeing how well this and the particle size stuff lines up with urine pHs, and then lines up with postpartum outcomes. The other thing, again, part of why we got interested in this CV anyway, and looking along the feed bunk, this is a small study that Casey had kind of done. Again, our study is, and we collaborated with Casey on this, again, which was an extension. And we've kind of been working on something called the liver health index. And liver health index basically measures concentrations of albumin, bilirubin, and cholesterol, and kind of as a composite index. We've related this now, improved liver health index. It relates to better milk production, less disease, better repro, things like that. So again, it's correlations and relationships anyway, but it's still interesting. And in a very small data set here, Casey was able, and there's 10 herds here. We see here as that variability, that CV and that close-up diet top screen, as that increases, so more variation there, we actually see the liver health index going down in these herds postpartum. So this is postpartum liver health index related to prepartum close-up diet variability along the bunk. And so again, we're interested in looking at this further, understanding this. This also lines up with other health indicators that we were looking at in these herds. All right, just going to comment on fresh cow nutrition for a minute. The vast majority of stuff that's been done in the whole transition cow nutrition world has really focused on the dry cow. And so, we feed different diets during the dry period. And then, essentially in almost all these studies, cows just went on to the regular herd diet, after calving. And so, a lot of nutrition stuff, lactating cow nutrition didn't start till cows were kind of out of the woods from a transition cow standpoint, but we've got a number of studies now looking specifically at feeding the fresh cow. Fresh cow diets are not a new thing by any means. They're frequently based upon the high cow diet. Some of the common tweaks that I see nutritionists doing is maybe a little less starch, maybe a little more physically effective fiber, but often that's less than really a pound of chopped straw or hay per day. Maybe some additional protein or amino acids, maybe a little more fat. Other nutrients like choline, maybe, pop the monensin up a bit, or rumensin, again, not a whole lot of research there until more recently, and people would gauge their success usually by, how the cow is doing at the farm level. And so some of the questions, and again, I'm not going to get into these in depth other than the last one, in the interest of time, how fermentable should these diets be? And this is another food fight in the industry. Do we really need to feed lower starch diets to fresh cows? And then what about starch fermentability? And there's been an argument, advanced mostly in academic circles, that maybe we need to feed lower starch diets or less fermentable to get better intakes. And I think the data sort of back that up, but I'll give you my 2 cents here. How important is physically effective fiber in fresh cow diets? So again, that's that structural fiber that helps the cow ruminate, saliva, buffer the rumen, good rumen function. I think it's really important. So we're going to make sure we meet those needs there. And they may be a little greater than what we previously thought. And then I'll share some new data for you with you on protein supply, that post-calving cow. So again, as I said, there's been a lot of work done here in starch here just lately. I would say, you look here, starch level in the fresh diet. There's work out of Minor Institute, Alberta, our group, work looking at starch source that was done at Michigan State, so that they compared high moisture corn versus dry corn. So high moisture, of course, be more fermentable. And then starch source and level in the fresh diet. And again, you see the Michigan State group there as well. All right, so the responses are mixed though. And so, you've got 4 studies on the bottom that had neutral or negative responses to either more starch or more fermentable starch, okay? You've got 2 studies on the top, one done in our group, one done at Michigan State, that showed actually, favorable responses to more starch or more fermentable starch. And so, if you look at these data kind of collectively, you're like, why do we get the differences there? And so, I went through the papers, kind of dug through them. And what's interesting is that, in the 2 studies that had favorable responses to more starch, they are definitely feeding more forage fiber. Okay, so there is more physically effective fiber, even more so than typical lactating cow diets going into these post-fresh diets. Okay. And the negative responses had either more typical levels of forage NDF in the lactating diet, or typical, or very low forage diet. So this study here, only 40% forage in the diet. This was only 50%. This one here is really low in forage NDF. And so I think what's happening here, when we get negative responses to more starch or more fermentable starch, we just don't have enough fiber in there to buffer the rumen. And so these studies, though, where they jacked up the fiber, forage NDF, okay, probably got more buffering in the rumen and saw better responses to higher starch. So I think you can kind of have it both ways here if you want. Just to give you a sense, this is a Michigan State work, just to give you a sense that you got to be careful not to push this too far. This is day postpartum. This is dry matter intake. Again, this was a study where they looked at dry ground corn versus high moisture. And so what they saw here is, what's interesting here is see the cows' intakes, they take off at calving. And then what happens is with this high NDF diet or high forage NDF diet, then they obviously start to limit from a capacity standpoint. So the intakes kind of level off and they don't increase again until they drop the diet down to a much more kind of typical forage NDF level, right? And then they take off again. So I guess my point here, and we've done research as well in our group where we pushed the fiber too hard in those fresh cows, and we didn't mean to do it that way. It was the treatment, we just landed in a higher place than we wanted to be, and we definitely saw those cows back off or have limited on feed intake. They had higher NEFAs, higher ketones, made less milk. So all kind of bad things. So I say just be careful with this. So, in this case, maybe they 10 to 14 days may have been long enough here. Maybe they didn't need to go as high. Maybe we didn't need to go as high. But I'm finding ourselves landing, depending on forage, digestibility of corn silage and haylage and quality of those ingredients. Maybe we're 2 pounds of chopped straw or hay, ideally straw, probably in that diet. We're not the pound anymore. We're usually a little higher than that in those meat post fresh cows, right? And obviously you're going to drop that down when they get out of the lactation a little bit. All right, going to kind of wind up here just by talking a little bit about MP and amino acids in the fresh cow. Again, this is some new work I'll share with you. Okay. And so, we've known for a long time, this is a graph that Alan Bell and Buzz Burhans and I put together a long time ago. It's just showing that just like most cows undergo some degree of negative energy balance, we can also calculate a negative protein balance as well. And so you can see this graph here, that kind of the most negative point in the deer is around 600 grams a day. And then they're kind of back to neutral by about 3 weeks after calving or so. So this was a small study done in Denmark by Mogens Larsen and his group, but really interesting study. And so what they did here is it was a small study. They only had 4 cows or eight cows, 4 per treatment. All these cows had rumen cannulas. They had infusion lines going through the cannula into the abomasum, and they basically infused a water control or casein, so kind of our perfect amino acid source or protein source. And all they were trying to do was wipe out this deficit in MP. Okay, that was all they were really trying to do. And they were curious what would happen. Okay, and so they supplied casein about 360 grams per. So this would stimulate rumen undegradable protein. So they supplied casein at about 3/4 of a pound at 1 day in milk. They upped it to about 1.5 pounds here at 2 days in milk. And then what they did is they backed off the infusion rate, a certain amount each day to kind of basically hold them even, right? They weren't trying to, so cows' intake increased as they got more MP from the diet, they backed off on the infusion. So this is what they found, right? So you see here, dry matter intakes, again, were very similar between the 2 treatments. MP supply, when they added in the casein, was by design elevated here, and you see those lines kind of coming together as the cows ate more feed. And the big thing they found was they made a lot more milk. And so milk yield was increased. This is about 15, 16 pounds per day in cows receiving additional MP by casein infusion after calving. So Trent Westoff, again, a PhD student working with Sabina Mann in our vet school here. We did a study where we wanted to look at both MP levels, both before calving and then also after calving. So this is MP predicted using the Cornell model of CNCPS. So we had cows on kind of on a typical far off diet. Here at they then switched on to, for the close-up period, they either stayed like on a control type diet. Okay, it's about 39 grams of MP per pound of dry matter, or a high MP diet. Okay, and then after calving, we further randomize them either onto a control, so kind of a more typical lactating cow diet level in terms of MP, or turbocharge, right? So we jacked up the MP to about 60 grams of MP per pound of dry matter. And we did that with mostly bypass soy sources, a little bit of an animal protein blend. One kind of unique design characteristic here is we actually fixed methionine and lysine supply to energy. Okay, and actually intakes were the same between the treatments before and after calving. And so these cows got so regardless of treatment, they got the same amount of methionine and lysine in terms of grams per day, but all the other amino acids were varied. Okay, if that makes any sense. Okay, so we didn't want this to be another, we know there's work out there with both methionine and lysine that show that methionine or lysine supplementation in these transition diets results in improved performance post calving. There's multiple studies from methionine. There's one out of Phil Cardoso's group for lysine, and there may be some others out there as well. But anyway, so we wanted to kind of fix that methionine and lysine supply. So we really were looking at metabolizable protein, metabolized amino acid supply. And then at 21 days after calving, they went on to a common diet, again, a more typical high cal level relative to MP. So just looking here at milk and milk components, okay, calving at 21 days of milk, I'll orient you across the top. This is the control pre-calving, high diet after calving, okay, high before calving, control after calving, and then the high, okay. And so, what we find here is that the cows fed the high, okay, so turbocharged on both sides, produced about 16 to 18 pounds more energy corrected milk compared to the control or the cows that were on the control after calving, okay. And so, really showing strong beneficial effects in terms of milk yield and energy corrected milk yield with turbocharging that fresh diet protein supply. Okay, cows really did not. It's kind of a mixed bag of data on pre-fresh MP feeding, and my speculation is that maybe in part because after calving they weren't going on to a higher protein diet, and I think if you can make an argument here that, well, maybe compared to the control high, there's 7 or 8 pounds of milk there, difference anyway. Okay. But the interesting thing also is that once they all went back onto the same diet, okay, these cows fed the high protein diet continued to make more milk than their others. So it's clearly a carryover effect, at least extending out into that part of lactation. And so this is, again, carryover response. So again, Trent's been looking at a lot of different things here relative to trying to understand mechanisms and things like that. But really interesting data. So we've been working with nutritionists and herds on this and some dairies, and still waiting for some feedback relative to what are we seeing. You should move if you try this, right? You should move if you're a dairy count person or whatever. You should be moving week 4 milk. So that would be the thing that I would key on is we made this change. Do we see upticks in week 4 milk? Obviously, you could look at peaks and different things like that too, but I would tend to look at week 4s before anything else. Also, get questions relative to colostrum here in the study. This is all available from the last year's proceeding, the Cornell Nutrition Conference, which is available for free online. Just search Cornell Nutrition Conference 2023. People ask about colostrum here. You see the MP supply, so we were pretty high with that prepartum. We did not see any effect on colostrum yield, nor on Brix percentage. And again, as a crude indicator of IgG. So again, no effect on colostrum, even though that's one of the things we often do when we get into colostrum issues at the farm level is maybe try to play around with the MP pre-fresh. So just to summarize, and then I'll unshare and we can take some questions. You see, Kathy, we've gotten almost even on time. Prepartum dietary management strategy is really key to prevent hypocalcemia, improving postpartum performance. We got to pay attention to detail when we're putting these control energy diets in for dry and close-up cows. Again, well implemented, they work great. Okay, not so well implemented, not so great. Okay, like everything else. And so, I think our fresh cow feeding strategy will continue to evolve. I do think there are opportunities to feed combinations of higher starch and higher fiber for better performance. So we can kind of have our cake and eat it too there a little bit. And then finally, I think, turbocharging postpartum MP supply, there's, I think, pretty compelling evidence that we're going to see milk yield responses there, and that those responses are not going to be just during the period you're feeding it, but also carrying over beyond that time. And again, who knows? Somebody will have to do a longer study to just see how long that those lines stay apart, but they certainly seem to hold reasonably well post beyond that fresh diet. So just say thanks. You've got a few questions in there. There's my email address. I'm easy enough to find. So thanks, Kathy, for the opportunity. I see we've got a pile of people participating today. So thanks you for taking your hour to spend with us.
Thanks, Tom. Great job. We do have a slew of questions, so why don't we go ahead and jump right into them? The first one is, I'm facing a lot of metritis in fresh pen, LDA, ketosis, huge udder edema. Do you have any thoughts for him?
Yeah, so metritis, right? Oftentimes think about energy, even beginning before calving. In other words, cows with inadequate energy will have a poor immune system to some extent. That would be one factor. Of course, there's all kinds of things that contribute to metritis relative to, again, pathogens, calving area management, all those kind of things, passion, again, cow comfort, those things all kind of contribute there. Ketosis obviously is multifaceted, but you get the DA ketosis coming together. I think, you certainly would look at prepartum diet, make sure you're controlling energy well. We know that cows that are overfed energy, 140, 150% or more of energy requirements during the dry period, far off or close up, are going to have higher ketones and more risk for DAs post calving. Udder edema is a tough one. Usually think about stressors in that one. Again, we don't have a great understanding of edema. There's certainly some school of thought relative to antioxidants or oxidant stress, things like that, being a contributor to edema. So that's one where, again, that one's been hard to go at. See, next question, best time to collect urine for measuring pH relative to feeding. Okay. Feeding the right dose of commercial DCAD product instead of slightly alkaline pH doesn't necessarily mean the dose is ineffective and our cow is at risk of subclinical hypocalcemia. Okay. So, we tend to favor, we generally say just be consistent. If I had to pick a time, we'd probably pick 6 to 8 hours post feeding. But be consistent. So relative to the right dose, okay, the right dose is the dose that drops the urine pH, right? So the cow's biology doesn't lie. And like, for example, like we're pretty routinely, we can get cows acidified to that 5.5, 5.6 with a DCAD of like -7 to 10 per 100 grams of dry matter in the diet, but there are herds that need to be at -20 to get cows acidified, right? Some of that's probably water, other management conditions, stuff that we probably don't understand, but we key in on urine pHs. The number on paper is the number on paper. Again, feed enough anions to get the pHs where you're targeting. So another question from Mohammed, do you recommend, willing to measure blood calcium level postpartum? What's your recommendation? Total or ionic calcium is helpful. What is the recommended measurement method? So we have done the most recent study that that I showed you on DCAD with calcium levels and things like that, we measured both total and ionic or total or ionized calcium in those samples. Total calcium is cheap, relatively speaking. Unfortunately, we do not have a validated on-farm calcium meter. Ionized calcium you can measure with what's called an I-stat. We did that in that study. It's like $17 a cartridge. You got to do it kind of right away. I will say, based on our experience, total calcium, we've yet to see any situation where ionized calcium has given us a different answer than total calcium. And, people are interested in ionized calcium for a good reason. It is the biologically active form of calcium. So they're like, okay, we should measure biologically active form of calcium. But remember, they're going to generally move together. Ionized is roughly half of total. We've done work that say we would increase to maybe 60% of total shortly after calving, but still they don't give us different answers. So total's fine. Some vet clinics have the ability to measure total calcium. There are some instruments that theoretically could be put on farm that would measure total calcium, but we yet to have a good calcium meter. Okay. One thing I will say is that Jess and group, Jess and Clara and others, they are really focusing on calcium at like day 4. They're not doing, they're doing very few measurements first 24 hours because those cows that drop in calcium, as long as they're not clinical milk fever cows, they're the cows that are kicking, they're getting off to a great start. Muhammad, again, Goldilocks approach. Yeah, optimal ME and MP per day. So Muhammad, send me an email. I will reply with some recommendations for you or with a document. In fact, I can do it for everybody but we would be, we're going to be, 110 to 120% of predicted requirements pre-fresh. Okay. 110 far off percent of predicted requirements for ME. We've kind of for MP for Holsteins, we've been in that 13 to 1400 gram range with recommendations. We'll probably live there, even though there's not a lot. I mean, Trent's data would say that there's not a huge response there unless you also kind of jack the protein post calving, et cetera. So I think that takes care of that one. Anonymous, short particle size increase from pH. So again, they did some stats modeling, to kind of look at those lines. I look at those data and I say those really aren't that different. Okay. I think the water addition one is much more compelling in terms of increase from room pH, again, for mechanisms I don't truly understand. So yeah, so that's kind of where we're at. It depends on the herd size. For example, varies from dairy to dairy. Is there any advantage to feeding a DCAD diet more than 21 days pre-fresh? No data to my knowledge. Most of the data that's out there where they fed it as long as 42 days would say there's no disadvantage. There's one study out of Florida that did show some negative responses to feeding longer to that 42-day. But there's 2 studies that basically say no difference. And is there advantage to feeding heifers a negative DCAD diet? Generally speaking, no. And so, I don't mind feeding the more aggressive DCAD to heifers as well, right? If herd size such for, we're going to feed one diet, but if their size such that they could have a close-up heifer pen and a close-up cow pen or older cow pen, I think it's probably okay to drop the DCAD out of the heifer diet. Again, the 5 studies I showed you, or 5 studies in meta-analysis, again, maybe a little negative effect on intake in heifers, kind of neutral for the other part, but again, a lot of variability there. All right, zeolite mechanism of action. So again, you drop blood calcium, so calcium goes really low, stimulates the vitamin D production. Again, you get resorption from bone. Vitamin D may be an important part of that mechanism through intestinal absorption. Okay, so these cows are primed to absorb calcium, once they hit that lactating diet. Okay. And or they're, again, they're better absorbing overall, right? Don't really have a full handle on the mechanism. Okay, but that's kind of what we know.
And then Tom, there's a question down below about zeolite. It says, what was the amount of the zeolite in the
Yeah.
experiment?
Yep. So we fed 500 grams. The companies, there's two companies marketing a synthetic zeolite A out there in the marketplace. And at the time we did our study, it was like 500 grams, regardless of anything else, right? Just straight 500 grams. Those companies are now both recommending kind of like nine to 10 times the phosphorus level in the diet. They're kind of making the story about phosphorus. Nobody's really shown that. But that makes a little more sense that it should relate to something in the diet. And so that actually lands people more now in that 350 to 400 gram range for Holstein. And so again, I'd like to see some research on it, but conceptually it makes sense to me.
Okay, folks, it's 1 o'clock, but Dr. Overton said that he can stay on and continue answering questions. So if you folks want to hang on and we'll work through the rest of the questions, but if not, we understand that you need to get on to the rest of your day. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So Marguerite here, how important is the long hay during the dry period to prevent displaced albumin? It's not. It's got to be chopped in the TMR. Okay. It's not gonna, that's by far the best way to do it. I mean, I suppose you could try to component feed, and that would be okay, but part of that's just keeping the energy levels under control. Okay. How convenient is sieving the wheat straw using the Penn State because of the shape of the straw? So yeah, we shake straw a bunch, so the key thing is you kind of want to, it's hard to be illustrated in the Zoom, right? But kind of want a good, not too much straw. So you're not going to use grams. You're going to use a volume, thing to do it. So it's got to be kind of, it's hard for me to describe it. Be about the size of a really small soccer ball, or a kid's soccer ball, not anything they play with, but those toy balls that you see. Christine, calcium does not cause milk fever after calving. So I recommend methionine choline supplementation. Transition cows both have a nice body of research literature studies backing them. The data would say, even though we connect them biochemically with each other, they work differently. Okay, so they seem to work differently in the cow. So the answer there is yes. I already answered a urine pH question. Baby calves being born from Carla. Baby calves born weak and without problem articulation, but calcium is high. Urine pH of baby calves. Urine pH. Yeah, hard to say. 5.3 is on the lowish side. I can't think of any literature that would say that you benefit by dropping the urine pHs below 5.5. So I would say, back off a bit on the DCAD. We have not done any work looking at urine pH of baby calves, so that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that part of your question. Is measuring room pH after 1 hour, 2 hour, and 3 hour feeding a good way to evaluate and determine rumen microbe digestion efficiency? If so, which method is? Well, at the commercial farm level, there's going to be a lot of variability among cows in room pH, I think. So I think, I think it's hard to think you've got representative cows that you might, you're not going to, really not going to stomach tube them, or anything like that. Obviously, a herd could have cannulated cows, a handful, but that would be uncommon. Certainly your room pH, if you had the boluses, right? Of course, you have room boluses out there now. Some which can do room pH and continuous monitoring. That's probably your best way, right? Because you have continuous monitoring with some of the bolus technologies. Hey, Alexander, how are you? From Argentina. Last trip to USA, visit nice one, giving positive DCAD diets, close up cows, average calcium with good results. What do you think? So, I don't think positive DCAD because of DCAD for lactating cows is a thing. I know it's in the NASEM. I know there's literature there. I know people have done it. If you look at the studies where they've done positive DCAD or done that treatment, all the things that you use to do positive DCAD have some buffering capacity in the rumen. Okay. So I actually think it's working, we think it's DCAD. I can hook biological mechanisms to DCAD, prepartum DCAD to calcium metabolism, all day long. I can't link any mechanism unless there might be a little potassium milk fat thing, rumen milk fat thing going on there to lactating cow diets. But I think it's buffering the rumen and helping maintain higher rumen pHs during that post-calving time. But I wish. No, there's a meter that is out there commercially available, marketed, that says it will do blood calcium. The folks that I know of, the academics that have evaluated that meter and actually worked to try to get it accurate for a long period of time, would say it's not accurate. So unfortunately, no on-farm test. Hey, Kathy, organic dairy feed our dry cows free choice baleage, free choice salt minerals, no way of course DCAD feeding, giving cows at third lactation more calcium bolus at freshening. Do you think we should continue the protocol? I think you're taking a good approach there again by targeting the older animals. I think you're unlikely to do harm there. So, I feel better about a bolus than a bottle at calving, as I think I kind of made the point. We did see, and again, I totally get the way you're doing things. You really can't do DCAD. The one thing you might think about is calcium. We did see, independent of DCAD strategy in our study, we saw better intakes in fresh cows if we jack that calcium up before calving. So that might be something to think about if there's a way within the free choice, salt minerals, if you get more calcium in there, the cows might benefit from that. But again, I don't see anything wrong necessarily with what you're doing on the bolus side. I mean, I do encourage herds to be a little more, try to be selective, right? Target higher risk cows, obviously third plus are gonna be higher risk. Maybe lame cows calving with twins, things like that. Some herds just want to cross the blanket and across the board stuff. But anyways. Recommendations for urine pH differ but good to see you, Kathy, on the Zoom. How are your recommendations for urine pH differ from Jerseys, Holsteins,